Veracruz, Mexico, 1914. A bullet barely misses your head as your squad leader drags you to the floor just in time. The famous Marine, Smedley Butler, hero of the Boxer Rebellion, glares at you and snarls, "Do you a death wish, Marine? Keep your head down. There are snipers everywhere." You're a US Marine on your first deployment, fighting your way house by house through the Mexican city of Veracruz. It's a terrifying experience. Danger is everywhere. Mexican soldiers and armed civilians firing from windows and all kinds of ingenious places. The whole city has risen up to resist the US invasion. You reach the building you have been taking sniper fire from. Butler kicks down the door and the squad storms inside. You search everywhere, jumping at shadows, but there's no sign of the snipers. A fellow Marine laughs and says, "They must have fled, those cowardly." He doesn't finish the sentence. Bullets shoot up from underneath the wooden floor, and his head jerks back, a bullet hole in the middle of his forehead. Another Marine lies on the floor screaming. There is only blood where his manhood used to be. "They're underneath the floor! Open fire!" shouts Butler. The whole squad fires volley after volley into the floor, then rip up the boards. 2 dead Mexicans dangle between the crossbeams. It's time to head on to the next building. Gunshots and shouts of "Death to the gringos!" echoing around you. I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
Da wird uns ausgebildet und wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen.
Hello everyone, welcome back. In 1914, overshadowed by the killing fields of Europe in the Great War, another conflict was raging across the pond. Mexico had plunged into revolution and civil war. A United States, caught with its pants down, was left frantically trying to protect its interests, supporting one faction and then another. Entangled in the snake pit of Mexican revolutionary politics, soon the urge to use force would become irresistible. Let us head to a fractured land, soon to be torn between hope and despair. Since independence from Spain in 1821, Mexico had been thrust into one turbulent episode after another. Civil wars raged. It was invaded by both France and the United States, while it flipped rapidly between monarchy, republic, and dictatorship. Stability, of a kind at least, broke out in 1876 when General Porfirio Diaz seized power in a coup. Fond of huge feathers in his hat and a chest so covered in medals he looked like a Christmas tree, and a large white moustache that would strike envy into the heart of a hipster, he was also a genuine hero of the war against the French. He would rule Mexico for the next 3 decades through a mixture of terror and tenocracy. With methods resembling the Empire in Star Wars, he waged genocidal campaigns against native peoples and killed his critics. Such was the level of terror that if telegraph wires were sabotaged near a village, that village would be blamed and destroyed. Mexico had stability, but it was the stability of the gun. Under his rule, there was economic growth and foreign investment poured in, but it only benefited the very wealthy, the small middle class, and foreign investors. The great mass of the poor were often virtual serfs, and didn't share in the prosperity. For US investors, however, Diaz was the best thing since sliced bread, with $2 billion flowing south of the border. 27% of all the land in Mexico was owned by Americans, mostly divided up into huge estates called haciendas. An embarrassed State Department report admitted conditions on these haciendas resembled the plantation slavery of the pre-Civil War South. The owners were shocked, I tell you. They condemned the report. How could white men on horses with guns and whips, shall we say supervising, Mexican peasants working in the fields, be compared to slavery? It's a mystery. For good measure, Americans also controlled most of the railways and the reserves of a certain hydrocarbon that had suddenly become important. Oil was about to influence US foreign policy for the very first time. It would not be the last. Huge oil deposits have been found along Mexico's Gulf Coast, with millions being made from drilling along the so-called Golden Lane. All in all, by 1910, Mexico was an economic colony of the United States in all but name. The good times couldn't last, however. Such a system was inherently unstable. Pressure built up and exploded into revolution in 1910, when Diaz mismanaged a succession attempt. His armies defeated by rebel forces, he fled the country. Peace would not return to Mexico with Diaz's ouster. The new liberal president, Madero, was a head-in-the-clouds intellectual type, unsuited for the snake pit of Mexican politics. Soon, with some help from the US ambassador, Henry Lane Wilson, he was overthrown by the military amidst horrific violence in the 10 tragic days. The belligerent and brutal General Victoriano Huerta became the country's latest strongman. His first action was to call the outgoing US President Taft to declare that, "I have the honor to inform you, I have overthrown this government. The armed forces support me." Plump, balding, and with a seemingly perpetual startled look on his face, he very much resembled the Hollywood archetype of a corrupt Mexican landowner. A former ally of Diaz, he had switched sides once he saw which way the wind was blowing, but he had no commitment to the revolution. Maneuvering himself into the presidency, he murdered Madero. Hated for his treachery, Huerta would ever after be known as the Jackal. He got on particularly well with US Ambassador Henry Lane. They had epic drinking sessions late into the night, allegedly both throwing up on the floor of the presidential office on more than one occasion. As Huerta and Henry had their bromance, the US business community were beginning to regret backing him. Stability hadn't returned. Instead, a whole new civil war had begun. Those who supported the revolution united to overthrow the Huerta regime. The renewed violence was having a bad effect on US investments, as we shall see. Acrid smoke fills your lungs, and shouts of "Viva la Revolution!" echo all around you. Surveying the vast estate owned by a gringo from the north, you still can't believe one man could control so much land. Once you were a mere peasant, working on this land for a pittance, fearing the whip of the overseers. Now you're a rebel soldier fighting against Huerta and his federales. This hacienda has been liberated. As the manor house burns, you spot a big, fat, greasy man sitting underneath a tree and being guarded by your comrades. You recognize him as the cruelest of the overseers, a man who enjoyed using the whip as much as possible. His eyes widen in recognition and terror when he sees you throw a noose over a nearby tree branch. Today, revolutionary justice will truly be served. USO mines were being blown up, estates were being seized, and even the precious oil wells were being damaged. Something had to be done. Famous media magnate William Randolph Hearst called for the immediate annexation of America's southern neighbor. In a full-page signed editorial, he declared that our flag should wave over Mexico as a symbol of rehabilitation of that unhappy country and its redemption to humanity and civilization. Perhaps unsurprisingly, he also owned the largest estate in northern Mexico. Others were a tad less extreme, prepared to settle for regime change instead of annexing the whole country. The man all this pressure fell on was US President Woodrow Wilson. If not the hero, then definitely the central figure of this series. The first Southerner elected to the presidency since the Civil War, he had spent his life as an academic before entering politics. He never lost that schoolmaster-type attitude or an overwhelming belief that he was always right. He was also a massive racist. He spread segregation into the federal bureaucracy and allowed the infamous film Birth of a Nation to be shown in the White House. A hymn of praise to the Ku Klux Klan, he famously said, "It's like writing history with lightning. My only regret is it's all so terribly true." While America had at least winked at Herter's coup, if not helped him, Herter had fallen foul of American democracy. His coup had happened under President Taft, but now he was dealing with Wilson. And he was outraged by the murder of Madero. The flames were further fanned by his closest advisor, Colonel Edward House, a major Southern power broker, and incidentally as much of a real colonel as I am. He had his own interests in Mexican oil. Along with some of his cronies, he had formed the Texas Company, later shortened to the more recognizable Texaco. Yep, this is where it all began, to exploit the oil boom in the Golden Lane. Herter was proving bad for business. Instead, they wanted the US to back his great rival in the Civil War, Venustiano Carranza. A bemused Herter had thought he would be America's man in Mexico. Now suddenly he was public enemy number one. Told to step down and allow democratic elections, he refused. Wilson in turn allowed weapons to pour across the border to the rebels. He even fired the American ambassador. The Herter and Henry Roadshow came to a sad end. Less publicly, a Marine was dispatched on a secret mission to the heart of the Jackal's power base, Mexico City. That Marine was Smedley Butler, already a legend in the making, who we met in the dramatization at the start of this episode. Pretending to be an American investor who supported the regime, he was given the red carpet treatment by officials desperate for cash. All the while he was taking notes. Returning to the States with his observations hidden in a secret compartment of his suitcase, he drew up plans for a coup at the bayonet point of the US Marines. The heavily armed Marines would somehow be disguised as door-to-door salesmen and tourists, before being smuggled into Mexico City using the American-controlled railway system. Seizing control of key strongpoints in the radio station, Herter would either be forced to step down or would suffer an accident. Wink, wink. Wilson lost his nerve, however, and the coup plot was shelved. He wanted more of a surgical strike that carried less risk. Events would soon give him just such an opportunity. On April the 9th, 1914, 1 month after Butler's spy run, the USS Dolphin in the Mexican port of Tampico was desperately in need of gasoline. Normally, this wouldn't be a problem. Tampico was at the heart of Mexico's oil industry, but fighting had broken out in the city and the vital gas stations had been destroyed. The captain learned that there were fuel cans in a German warehouse, but to get there they would have to send a smaller vessel up a nearby canal. 9 unarmed sailors in a rowboat went to fetch the fuel, and that's when the trouble started. Entering a restricted area, they were surrounded by heavily armed Mexican soldiers and taken prisoner. As soon as the military governor found out what had happened, they were quickly released with an apology. That should have been the end of the so-called Tampico affair, but it was too perfect an incident not to blow out of all proportion. Rear Admiral Henry Mayo, commanding the Tampico squadron, demanded that the Mexicans hoist the American flag in a prominent position on shore and salute it with 21 guns. Herter was bending over backwards not to start a fight with the US, but this was too much. If he gave in, it would destroy his nationalist credentials. The incident seemed to grow more terrible by the day. US officials released false reports that the sailors had been paraded through the streets, all the while being whipped by evil federales and jeered at by a baying mob. The completely unbiased Hearst press leapt on the story with glee. Headlines of "Latest Mexican Insult to Old Glory" and "Why Herter Must Apologize for Tampico Atrocity" followed. If you were a suspicious person, it was almost as if powerful interests wanted to justify military action. The whole Tampico affair reminds me so much of the Arrow incident in the Second Opium War. Listen to episode 18 if you want to find out more. Wilson grimly vowed that the salute will be fired, and ordered both the Atlantic and Pacific fleets to steam towards Mexico. Herter finally offered to stage a reciprocal salute. First, a Mexican battery would salute the US flag. Then, US ships would salute the Mexican flag. But this didn't appease Wilson's wrath. As military action seemed inevitable, both Mexicans and Americans thought the battleground would be Tampico. However, the blow would actually fall elsewhere due to ridiculous circumstances. Wilson was woken early one morning to terrifying news. A huge shipment of arms had been sent by Imperial Germany to aid the Jackal, and it was heading to the port of Veracruz. It sounds like the plot of a second-rate thriller, but the reality was even more bizarre. Those guns had nothing to do with the German government. They'd been purchased by the Sausage King of Mexico. Yes, you heard that right. Who was the Sausage King of Mexico, and why was he buying guns for Herter? John Decay was an American who'd made a vast fortune owning the largest slaughtering and meat distribution operation in Mexico, hence his unofficial title. However, his gilded life had taken a beating in the Civil War, and his business was in ruins. Mysteriously, the Jackal's regime had bailed him out. It was not out of the goodness of his heart. Decay had something they needed. He had decent credit with international bankers, unlike the regime. He could borrow some funds to buy Herter some guns. Wilson didn't know about the Sausage King, however. Fearing Germany was about to intervene in Mexico's affairs, he ordered US forces to seize the shipment. In a rather odd bit of reasoning, Wilson decided he did not want to intercept a foreign ship on the high seas. That would be illegal. It would be much better to seize the wharves where it was going to unload. How this was any better, I do not know. US forces headed to Veracruz, Mexico's most important Atlantic port. From a distance, Veracruz looked beautiful, a picture postcard of beaches and pastel buildings, surrounded, in the words of one Marine, by indigo waters, sand hills, white walls, and coconut palms, mountain peaks piercing the clouds. On closer inspection, the narrow cobblestone streets were littered with garbage and rotting animal carcasses. Giant black vultures, called zipolits, circled overhead, and mongrel dogs ran wild. A powerful stench pervaded everything and could be smelt miles away. Wilson assumed American troops would be welcomed as liberators by the, quote, submerged 85% of the people of that republic who are now struggling towards liberty. As he would find out, this was a dangerously naive view. If there was one thing that all of Mexico's warring factions could agree on, it was that they didn't want America invading their territory yet again. America seized the walls without a fight, but inside the city, resistance was already stirring. Veracruz's military commander, General Gustavo Mas, was determined to resist. He distributed arms to a civilian militia called the Defenders of the Port of Veracruz. He even armed convicts from the local prisons and sent 100 of his soldiers to the waterfront with orders to repel the invasion. Just after they set out, he received orders from Mexico City to withdraw his force without a fight. Mars evacuated most of his 1,000 men, but by then it was too late to prevent bloodshed. A shot rang out and instantly killed Corporal Daniel Haggerty, a U.S. Marine on a hotel roof. Mexican snipers took up positions and began raining bullets down on the Americans. Casualties started mounting among the expeditionary force, and by 2 p.m., 4 Americans were dead and 20 were wounded. The U.S. commander frantically tried to find someone, anyone, in authority on the Mexican side to negotiate with. The mayor of Veracruz was discovered hiding in his bathroom, sitting on the toilet nonetheless, but claimed he had no authority over those fighting. With his forces bogged down, it was decided they would have to take the whole city. As they approached the Naval Academy building, they were in for a nasty surprise. The Americans had encountered the fortress-like academy before in the Mexican-American War. In the Marine anthem, the Halls of Montezuma line is to commemorate the battle to capture it. Once again, it will be a hard fight for the US. Commodore Manuel Azuta had raced to the academy as soon as the Americans arrived, rousing the students with the famous cry, "To arms, boys! Our homeland is in danger! Viva la Mexico!" 128 cadets armed themselves and took up their positions. They wouldn't have to wait long. Armed US sailors in blue uniforms approached the academy. Unused to ground combat, especially in a city, the sailors marched in close formation, like they were Napoleonic or Civil War soldiers. Inevitably, they were perfect targets for the cadets. As they picked off the Americans at will, it must have seemed as though they could repel the invasion all by themselves. The sailors, however, were soon joined by the Marines, who were quickly learning the do's and don'ts of urban combat the hard way. Outnumbered and running out of ammunition, the cadets prepared for a final stand, when suddenly the American advance was briefly halted by an act of extraordinary bravery. Imagine you are a defender of the academy watching this famous moment. No matter how many you kill, the Americans are getting closer and closer. They rake the academy with gunfire. A nearby cadet clutches his leg and screams. The Commodore shouts to you all to make every bullet count, when suddenly machine gun fire fills the air. Many advancing Yankees scream in pain and fall to the floor. In amazement, You see, the Commodore's own son, Jose, has set up a machine gun in the street. Alone, he defies the invaders, refusing to take cover. Soon a bullet smashes into his right knee, but he keeps firing. Then another shot hits him. You don't know what comes over you, but the next minute you are racing outside to rescue him. Sniper bullets ricochet against the cobbles as you drag him towards the academy. You are almost there when a third shot hits him in the head. Pain, shock, and blinding hate war within your head. Picking up a rifle, you vow to make the gringos pay for Jose's death with their blood. Jose Azerta had joined the army rather than following his father into the navy. However, when the army retreated from Veracruz, he opted instead to race to join his father at the Naval Academy. The academy only fell after being shelled by 3 American warships. Thanks to Jose's sacrifice, his father and many of the cadets were able to escape. There's still a ceremony every year in Veracruz to celebrate his bravery. He was only 19. Such can be the cruelty of war. Far from being welcomed, the Americans were having to fight for every street and almost every house. Butler later remembered that
Mexicans in the houses, on the roofs and in the streets, peppered us from all directions. Some fired at us with machine guns. Since the Mexicans were using the houses as fortresses, the Marines rushed from house to house, knocking in the doors and searching for snipers.
they were fighting an often colourful cast of characters. The young Judith Opreza, who threw bricks from her rooftop at the Americans. The prostitute, aptly nicknamed America, who set her ammunition belt on a flat roof and fired down at the gringos, and an elderly woman who knocked out a Marine with a well-thrown plant pot. Despite the brave resistance, by noon on Wednesday, April the 22nd, 1914, the sailors and Marines had complete control of Veracruz. In the process, the Americans suffered 22 killed and 70 wounded. The exact American losses are unknown, but at least 126 had died and 195 were wounded. Wilson had Veracruz. What was he going to do next? The answer was nothing much. The whole operation had been launched to seize the Sausage King's weapons shipment, but due to an international outcry, Wilson was forced to let the ship go. It just went to another Herta-controlled port instead, and he still got his weapons. With the primary mission an embarrassing failure, Wilson's generals demanded he let them march on Mexico City and overthrow the Jackal. Wilson, however, had lost much of his martial ardour. He was genuinely shocked about the fighting in Veracruz. A reporter who attended a press conference Wilson held on April the 23rd described him as preternaturally pale, almost parchmenty. The death of American sailors and Marines, owing to an order of his, seemed to have affected him like an ailment. He was positively shaken. At the same time, the cold politician in him knew that the occupation of Veracruz was leading to international condemnation, while the embers of anti-Americanism had burst into life across Mexico and South America. An Argentinian political cartoon summed up the prevailing Latin view when he depicted a menacing Uncle Sam demanding of a Mexican, "Salute my flag, like it deserves, or I'll take off your hat with my cannon shot." Even Herta became briefly popular for standing up to the gringos. To advance would lead to heavy casualties and sinking further into the Mexican mire. To withdraw right away, though, would be to admit Wilson had blundered. Instead, he went for the third option of holding on to Veracruz, but not declaring war on the Mexican government. An awkward stalemate developed. To further cover up the Veracruz debacle, 56 Medals of Honor were awarded, the most for any single engagement in American history. Smedley Butler received one and was incensed at this, quote, unutterably foul perversion of our country's greatest gift, end quote. He tried to return his decoration, but the Navy Department insisted he keep it and proudly wear the medal at all official functions. To spare a president's blushes, America occupied Veracruz for the next 7 months. In charge was the American-Filipino war veteran Brigadier General Frederick Funston, most famous for declaring that critics of that war ought to be strung up on the nearest lamppost. Despite successes in cleaning up Veracruz and fighting disease, he ruled a hostile and sullen city where the majority of civil servants refused to serve the Americans. Bored out of their mind, the US soldiers turned to the wholesome pastimes of visiting bordellos and getting blind drunk. No matter where you are in history, soldiers never change. One of the few Americans to enjoy an adventure was an army captain named Douglas MacArthur. Yes, that MacArthur. Assigned to Funston's staff as an intelligence officer, Douglas decided to slip out of Veracruz with a few Mexican railway workers to bring back some locomotives, which were in short supply in the city. Somehow, MacArthur returned with 3 locomotives and an amazing tale of having to shoot it out with a party of Mexican cavalry that attacked his little band. MacArthur was incensed that he did not win a Medal of Honor for this exploit. Considering that they were handing them out like sweets at Halloween in this campaign, he was more justified than normal for being aggrieved. The stalemate was only broken when the Herter regime was finally overthrown. Though Wilson tried to take the credit, the occupation of Veracruz had played little role in the downfall of the Jackal. Instead, it was the battlefield's successes of Carranza's rebel coalition. With Herter gone, Wilson negotiated a face-saving treaty with Carranza, and American troops finally pulled out of Veracruz. For such a small conflict, the invasion of Veracruz would have big after-effects. Anti-Americanism reached record levels among the Mexican population, and Herter, trying to ride this wave, expelled the 50,000 American expats living in the country. Let's visit this exodus. The crowd is angry, baying for blood and vengeance. After 10 years in Mexico as a mining engineer, this wasn't how you thought it would end. Your family carries what little belongings you have been allowed to take, heading to the train that will drop you back into the United States. But first, you must run the gauntlet of rage. As soon as the first Americans appear, the crowd surges forward before being pushed back by federales. Shouts of, "Death to the gringos! Down with America! Free Veracruz!" explode from the hate-filled faces on either side. You tell your family to keep walking and not to look at them. Then they start throwing stones at anything that comes to hand. Something hits your wife. Luckily, it was just a rotten tomato. Finally, you reach the relative safety of the train. A decade of your life undone in such a short time. Mines you have helped set up have been destroyed, and you have been driven from your home to an uncertain fate in America. The relationship between the US and your adopted country, poisoned, seemingly beyond repair. Refugee camps would be set up in New Orleans, Texas City, and San Diego for those displaced. Relations between the two countries arguably wouldn't recover until the Second World War. In the meantime, various American enemies were happy to exploit this division, from German diplomats to rogue warlords to bandits. America's border with Mexico was not going to quiet down any time soon. All in all, it's hard not to agree with the assessment of one American official that the whole affair was a screaming farce that shouldn't have happened. Yet Wilson seemed to have learnt little. When America entered World War I, he once again thought about invading Veracruz and Tampico to gain control of the vital oil reserves. The only reason America didn't is because Carranza threatened to blow up all the oil rigs if they did. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like, subscribe, leave a review, or tell a friend. Next time, we'll be investigating some of the blowback from the Veracruz adventure. With American-Mexican relations at a record low, a bandit-turned-revolutionary general turned warlord would see an opportunity to revive his political fortunes. In 1916, he would launch a bloody attack on the US mainland, leading to a full-on American invasion of Mexico. Join me next time for the hunt for Pancho Villa.